In this series, we're going to go over all the cards in the Commander ban list and discuss why they're banned and talk about if they could be unbanned. Today, we're going to go over cards that tend to stop your opponent from being able to play the game at all, which is about as problematic as it sounds. Starting us off, we have a pair of cards in Leovold, Emissary of Trest, and Hullbreacher. These cards were both banned for mostly the same reason. Starting with Leovold, this is a 3/3 Legendary Elf Advisor creature with a mana cost of 1 black, 1 green, and 1 blue. It has the abilities where your opponents can't draw more than 1 card each turn. And whenever you or a permanent you control becomes a target of an ability an opponent controls, you draw a card. This card was banned in April of 2017. Hullbreacher is a 3/2 Merfolk Pirate with a mana cost of 2 and 1 blue. It has Flash, meaning you can cast it at any time you can cast an instant, and it has the ability where whenever an opponent would draw a card, except for the first card they draw during each of their draw steps, instead you create a treasure token. This is an artifact token with an ability where you can tap it and sacrifice and add 1 mana of any color. This card was banned in July of 2021. Now, why were these cards banned? These cards were both banned because of how they interact with wheel effects. Wheel is the name the community has given to cards like Wheel of Fortune that force all players to discard their hand and draw a new one. Of course, you may notice that with cards like Leovold and Hullbreacher out, this won't be possible, as they both stop your opponent from drawing cards. Leovold at least allows them to draw 1 card, while Hullbreacher will entirely stop them from drawing anything. And since these wheel effects will either force your opponent to discard their hand or shuffle their hand back to the deck, they'll end up with either 1 card or no cards in hand. While you'll be getting away with drawing an entirely new hand, and since most wheels hit the entire table, this usually wins you the game. However, if this was where the issue ended, these cards wouldn't have been banned. In CEDH, there are better ways to close a game, or at the very least, other win conditions that are as good as this. In fact, there are still other cards that have a very similar effect that are still legal in the format, such as Notion Thief, which allows you to draw a card instead of your opponent whenever you would draw a card outside of their draw step, and Narset, Parter of Veils, which just has the same text as Leovold at the same mana value. Both Leovold and Hullbreacher have something that make them better than these other cards. Leovold, being a legendary creature, is capable of being your commander, which makes all these combos far scarier and more consistent. Even without these combos, Leovold is already a good enough commander. Having the ability to just win the game whenever you want, on top of all the rest of the value, was just too much to deal with. Hullbreacher has Flash, making him far more difficult to play around. You can just cast him at the end step before your turn after each other player has tapped out, and then perform the combo, pulling it off on turn 4 without giving your opponent a chance to respond. Faster than any other version of this effect can go off without having to pass your opponent and giving them a chance to play their cards out. So these cards may be the worst versions of these sorts of draw locking effects. But is the combo even bannable? After all, like we said, there are better combos available in the format. There are a couple of things that push this specific combo into the realm of being problematic. 1, the combo is miserable to play against, and 2, all the cards in the combo are things you'd want to play anyway, so they were seen playing tons of decks that other combos weren't. Speaking to the first issue, most combos that win the game actually do end the game. While refilling to 7 and putting all your opponents to 0 cards does basically end the game, it doesn't actually end the game. Your opponents will still have to sit there and basically do nothing for several turns as you slowly find an actual win condition. This is pretty miserable, but not necessarily enough to ban the card on its own. The thing that makes it so ban-worthy is the second issue, how playable all the cards in the combo are. Cards like Wheel of Fortune are incredibly useful cards that see tons of play in the format in a wide variety of decks, and these anti-draw effects are really strong even outside of the combos. The result was a ton of people who didn't normally play instant win combos still playing both these cards anyway, leading to this combo to see way more play at weaker tables. This caused a big issue at lower levels of play. And since a CEDH-ish combo was running around at mid-level tables, the cards were banned. What are the arguments for unbanning Leovold and Hullbreacher? The only real argument that people bring up is that cards like Narset are still legal, but that's usually in the context of wanting Narset banned as well. These types of cards are extremely hated. People hate any card that makes it so that you can't play, and these cards were really strong. Most of the community recognized the problem of combining these cards with wheels, but didn't have an issue with either half of their combos individually. This leads to a complicated situation where people have lots of different opinions on exactly how these cards should be handled on the ban list. However, most people are pretty happy to see these gone just because of how frustrating they are to play against. All this to say, this is one of the less controversial bans in the format. The main reason some would want them unbanned is that, from a more competitive perspective, there are bigger issues. It's not actually the most powerful combo in the format, and fun is a subjective term after all. Of course, this is Commander, and the format is more focused on making a fun, casual environment rather than a tournament setting. And the majority of people seem to agree that this type of gameplay isn't fun, so the cards are probably going to stay on the ban list. Next up we have Iona, Shield of Emeria. This is a 7/7 legendary angel creature with a mana cost of 6 and 3 white. It has flying, meaning it can't be blocked except by other creatures with flying or reach. And it has the abilities where, as Iona enters the battlefield, you choose a color. And the ability where your opponents can't cast spells of the chosen color. This card was banned in July of 2019. Now, why was Iona, Shield of Emeria, banned? Iona was banned due to how it can shut out players from playing the game. While there are a lot of cards that can do this, Iona is a bit unique in the specific way it does this. The main thing is the card restricts actions based on color, which means that if an opponent is on a mono-color deck and you call that deck's color, they can only cast colorless spells for the rest of the game. The ability to just completely shut off another player is really annoying to play against, or in this case, not play against. While the card costing 9 mana is really high, there are tons of ways to cheat creatures into play quickly. Cards like Reanimate are completely legal in the format, and other forms of mana cheating like Molasses Citadel and Tooth and Nail are pretty common in the format too. Getting Iona out isn't nearly as difficult as it may look. Iona is the kind of card that the rules committee really doesn't like running around, as it requires you to build your deck in very specific ways to get around the card. For all those reasons, Iona was banned. What are the arguments for unbanning Iona? Now, this is one of the most contentious cards currently on the ban list. There are a few layers to this. First off, the card is seen as a signpost ban. Basically, more of a symbolic move than a card that was banned to actually change anything. You see, while Iona does have a strong block effect, it's not even close to the strongest or most disruptive effect of this kind of the format. Cards like Stasis and Winter Orb have far more impact on the games they're played in and on the format as a whole. Both of these cards stop players from untapping their permanents, including their lands, meaning that no player can cast spells because they don't have any mana. Cards like Armageddon can destroy all the lands in play, also preventing anyone from playing anything. So why would they ban Iona rather than these other more impactful cards? Honestly, I have no idea what they were thinking. Iona is a very disruptive card, and it's just not worse in any meaningful way than any of the other cards. It seems like the only reason they would have banned this card is actually because of how weak it is. You see, stacks effects are really important for Commander at high powered tables. Without these sorts of effects, the game usually just devolves into all-in combo decks. The only color that can compete with combos without these sorts of stacks effects is blue thanks to its counter magic. Every other color has to rely on these lock pieces to slow the game down if they're not trying to combo off. So, if the RC had banned a card like Winter Orb, that could have risked actually messing up CEDH, whereas Iona, as a much weaker card, wouldn't change anything. But banning Iona does send a message, at least theoretically, that playing lock pieces is something RC doesn't want you to do. And honestly, this whole thing feels really silly. This is a very inconsistent ban, and even in terms of big expensive creatures with lock effects, cards like Void Winnower are just as disruptive and perfectly legal. Iona should probably just come off the list at this point, as her being banned isn't really doing anything. Next up we have Erayo, Sorotari Ascendant. This is a 1/1 legendary Moonfolk monk creature with a mana cost of 1 and 1 blue. It has flying and the ability where, whenever the 4th spell of a turn is cast, you flip it. This means rotating 180 degrees into Io's Essence, a legendary enchantment, with the ability where you counter the first spell each opponent casts each turn. This card was banned in September of 2011 as your commander, meaning it could still be played in your 99, but was moved to the normal ban list when this list was abolished in 2014. Why is Erayo banned? Well, because the flip version of the effect is basically impossible to play against. It's just way too easy to flip, and Erayo can be your commander. First off, casting 4 spells on a turn just isn't hard if you're actively trying to do this. If you play a bunch of cards like Ataxian Probe that cost 0 or 1 mana and cycle, you can pretty easily get up to 4 spell casts on turn 3 and still have plenty of room for a win condition in your deck. Once Erayo flips, you should probably just scoop if you don't have a good way to answer it right away. Having to give up the first spell you cast each turn makes it basically impossible to win. But even worse, makes it basically impossible to stop Erayo players from winning. If you want to develop your own board, you have to give up both an entire card and all the mana you spent on that spell, meaning you're basically going to be doing nothing most turns and losing a ton of cards. Even if you have a removal spell for Erayo right there, the Erayo player is playing blue, and probably has counter magic to protect their commander. However, it also makes interacting with that player on any player's turn basically impossible. If you have a removal spell or a counter spell, you can basically never actually play them. You'll have to develop another entire card in front of them to get them to resolve, and even if another player casts something, Erayo sees each opponent individually. So if the Erayo player is going for their combo and about to win, and even if each opponent has an answer, if one player doesn't have an answer and another castable spell, they can't actually do anything. And this is true for all 3 of that player's opponents. Basically, Erayo makes doing anything impossible for most of the players at a table. But unlike cards like Winter Orb, it's a valid commander. This means you will still have access to it every game, and be able to build your deck around it, making sure you make the most out of the card. There's no commander that's quite as disruptive as Erayo at its peak. Even Leovold isn't quite this bad. It's no wonder the RC decided to hit this card. What are the arguments for unbanning Erayo? The main argument would be probably the card isn't as good as it used to be, and while that is somewhat true, the card hasn't fallen off enough to be fair. I feel like people are underestimating how easy casting 4 spells in a turn actually is, especially since it counts spells being cast by all players, not just the Erayo player. You could also try to argue that the card mostly sees play at higher power level tables, so it would be less disruptive. The thing is, even at high-powered, non-CEDH tables, this card is really hard to play against, and people will play it there. The card may even still be an issue in CEDH, though that's not exactly my wheelhouse. Erayo is just too good of a card to have in your command zone. The best solution is probably bringing back the banned as commander list, but that's another discussion. The bottom line is that Erayo cannot be allowed to be in the command zone. Next up, we have Upheaval. This is a sorcery with a mana cost of 4 and 2 blue. It has the effect to return all permanents to their owner's hands. This card was banned in April of 2005. Why was Upheaval banned? The card is basically a super Armageddon, completely sending all players back to square one, but being much more powerful. It doesn't just get rid of all the lands, making it so the player can't cast spells until they replay their lands. It also gets rid of all other permanents on the board, so players won't have any threats left on the board, but possibly more importantly, it also gets rid of all mana rocks and mana dorks. This means that, unlike the mass land destruction spells, there's not really a way to still have some action after a player casts Upheaval. The only real way to get around Upheaval is with a card like Teferi's Protection, which is such a specific answer that you can't really rely on it to answer this card. On top of that, Upheaval is also just a really good card. Because you get to choose when Upheaval happens, you could make sure to put yourself in a good position to catapult ahead the rest of the table. Typically, what you would do is wait until you have around 8 or 9 mana. Then cast Upheaval without playing land for a turn. You would float all of your extra mana, and after the Upheaval resolves, you play land for turn and redeploy all your mana rocks. This would put you way far ahead on mana, as you were the only player who could redeploy after Upheaval with their extra mana. This all makes Upheaval quite possibly the most practical and powerful mass land destruction in the game, and for that reason, the card was banned. Now, what are the arguments for unbanning Upheaval? The main argument is that other mass land destruction and trolley cards are currently off the ban list, such as Armageddon and Worldfire. However, there are a few notable differences between Upheaval and those cards. The main difference is that it's far easier to make Upheaval good than any of those other cards, which may lead to it seeming more play than any other similar card. Upheaval answering the board makes it a lot more attractive in a lot of board states than typical mass land destruction spells. Armageddon will often leave you in a losing position if you cast it, so you have to make sure you're ahead on board enough to close out a game whenever you cast it, or that you found a way to protect your lands from its effects. Upheaval only asks that you have enough extra mana to redeploy some of your threats, which is way more manageable. In comparison to Worldfire, it's a lot easier to redeploy your threats after an Upheaval since you'll still have a hand. This means you don't have to build around the card to anywhere near the same degree. Worldfire requires pretty specific cards to combo off, whereas Upheaval works with any spells. This means that Upheaval would be more likely to see far more play than Worldfire does. Basically, the card is meaningfully better than other similar effects, so it's likely to see more play and cause more problems than those other cards, though that's still a debatable topic. And finally, we have Sway of the Stars. This is a sorcerer with a mana cost of 8 and 2 blue. It is the effect where each player shuffles their hand, graveyard, and all permanents they control back into their deck, then draw 7 cards. Also, each player's life total then becomes 7. This card was banned in April of 2005. Why was Sway of the Stars banned? The card was banned for being really annoying to play against, plain and simple. The card doesn't have too many broken applications that other cards don't do better. Rather, a card that resets literally everyone's zones and sets each player to 7 life made it so that nothing that happened in the game up to that point where Sway resolved actually mattered. All that really matters at that point is whoever draws a good enough hand to close the game before anyone else. Considering that there's not much strategy in playing the card and how fun it is, the card was banned. What are the arguments for unbanning Sway of the Stars? One big argument is that Worldfire was unbanned and has mostly been fine. Worldfire was banned for mostly the same reason as Sway of the Stars. So if it's okay, Sway is also probably okay. Now, to be honest, Sway being on or off the ban list is mostly a matter of personal preference. Worldfire does have some more straightforward combo implications due to setting people's life totals to 1, making it better at ending games, whereas Sway mostly only prolongs games. However, it's not that there's no combos with Sway of the Stars, even if they're more difficult to pull off. The card does have some legitimate applications, so the card being banned could be a sore spot for some players. Not to mention, there are cards like Thieves' Auction that similarly make the entire game up to the point they're played not matter, despite not actually being good. Ultimately, the card's banning feels extremely arbitrary, which may leave a lot of people to advocate for the card coming off the ban list. Alright, and that's the video. Do you have any ideas for videos similar to this one? If so, leave a comment down below.